Welcome to Firearms Friday here in Cheyenne. I'm Evan Green. I'm the firearms historian for the Wyoming State Museum, but today I'm a guest at the Cheyenne Frontier Days Old West Museum. And my host is Mike Castle.
Hello again.
Mike is the curator of collections here. He's an adjunct professor of history at Larimer County Community College, is the author of several books and co-author of several books about Cheyenne and Wyoming history. So a real treat to spend some time with you, specifically around working on your firearms collection.
I'm glad you're here, and it's fun to have you here to take a look at these.
I really enjoyed it and learned a few things, as I always do. So this one was a puzzle. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what this thing is, because it has been used and scrubbed, so there were no markings on it to give me a clue. It is a percussion muzzleloader in about 55, 58 caliber. So I went on a hunt because percussion firearms, and particularly those that appear to be of military origin, kind of fall in between, say, 1825 to 1870. 1825 was when the percussion ignition system started replacing the flintlock. Took a while for the military to get on board with that. But then in 1870, we saw the Spencer and Henry repeating rifles, cartridge rifles, using a self-contained cartridge, which made the percussion operating system obsolete. While that's true, those remained in use for years and years after cartridge firearms were available. So I did my usual bit of research and thought, this appears to me to be a pattern 1853 Enfield. Hammer shape kind of matches, stock configuration kind of matches, rear sight on the barrel, got the ramrod, but the pattern 1853 were rifled, and this one is smoothbore. Why would that be? Well, you go down the hole into history, and as many of you probably know, in the middle of the 19th century, the East India Company was basically the government of the country of India. And in fact, the East India Company had their own private armies, and they had more men under arms in that period of time than the British did in their army. So somebody said it's sort of like Microsoft would contract with Blackwater to take care of the competition and keep the peasants in line. So anyway, I said, okay, that's kind of interesting. Let's talk about, again, the role of the East India Company in arming the native troops. In 1856, the East India Company bought 10,000 of these Enfield muzzle-loading long guns. Some of them were in this carbine configuration. This turned out to be an artillery carbine. Some were a full-sized, full-length rifled musket. And because they were rifled, the bullets had to be lubricated. And the loading procedure in those days for that type of firearm, you were issued as a soldier a box of paper cartridges. These were paper that contained both the bullet and the powder charge. And the loading procedure was you supported that rifled musket with your offhand, you bit off and opened the paper with your teeth, poured the powder down the barrel, and then seated the bullet with that ramrod. Well, the Brits, in their infinite wisdom, greased those bullets with animal fat. And if it was beef fat, it offended the Hindus. If it was pork fat, it offended the Muslims, to the degree that they refused to go through the loading procedures. And while there were the usual offenses perpetrated on a native population by the colonizers. That particular incident around the firearms and the animal fat on the bullets triggered the Sepoy Revolution of 1857. About 10,000 British men, women, and children were killed by the native troops, and some estimates say as many as 150,000 native Indians were killed in the process of that revolution before it was finally suppressed. And the fallout afterwards resulted in the deaths of a lot more Indian civilians and military soldiers. So why isn't it rifled? What? Again, doing a little more reading, that after the Sepoy Revolution, the British either bored out the rifling from the rifled muskets or contracted to have them issued as smoothbores when they purchased them. And the reason was the East India Company people and their private army was afraid they might suffer another rebellion, and by taking out the rifling, it made the firearm much less accurate. So this is actually a model 1858 Enfield artillery carbine. And one of the really interesting things about this that also confused me at the start is there's a little embossed emblem right here. And we'll get a better picture of that, I think, to put up with the video. But it's Arabic script. And I went, why on a British-made firearm would there be that Arabic stamp? Well, it turns out that these carbines like this, were issued to the native cavalry. 95% of them were Muslim. And I've tried several ways to get a translation of that stamp, and I've got some different answers, and I don't have the truth out of it yet. So another thing that was interesting about this is that, again, you see this typical corrosion that's been polished out, really, but the typical corrosion resulting from the fragments of the percussion cap and the explosion of that percussion cap, which channeled a ribbon of fire into the main charge in the barrel, ends up corroding the surface of the back of the barrel. But take a look. This is not the original stock, because the original stock would have similar burn marks around the area of the hammer and around this boss that held the percussion nipple. So again, kind of a confusing gun, and it took several days to finally figure out what it was, but I think we got it nailed. And so, it's kind of my favorite gun just because the story is so interesting. And I'll bet, as a curator of collections, you have some favorite artifacts.
It's a hard thing to do that because, it's kind of like asking a parent
what's
what's their favorite
children?
kid.
Yeah.
Depends on the day.
Right.
All right, so what happens is we got several different artifacts that I love, and it depends on the collection. I've got a favorite piece of art, which is, we call it Happy Hour, shows horses in a line at a trough. I have another collection that's Native American artifacts that we had mentioned before,
Great
but
stuff,
it's the
yeah.
dress of Princess Bluewater, who performed with Buffalo Bill Cody as a 7-year-old girl, met the Queen of England, but refused to kiss her hand because she said to the Queen, "Why should I kiss your hand? I didn't kiss the hand of our president." Right, so she was an interesting woman, but she actually was at Cheyenne Frontier Days from the 1920s until the early 1960s, running the Indian Village and all the performers.
Wow.
So a wonderful connection there too. So that's one of my favorite things from that collection. But if I really got pushed, the one thing that I love in this collection more than any other happens to be one of our stagecoaches. This is a vehicle. It's I believe it's number 168, or actually, I think I'm wrong. I think it's number 162. I could get in trouble for that if I don't know. But it rode for Cheyenne Frontier Days for decades in our parades. Mm-hmm. But it has a much longer history than Cheyenne Frontier Days. It is an original stagecoach or mud wagon that used to roll from Cheyenne to Deadwood, South Dakota during the Black Hills Gold Rush from 1876 until about 1881. And so this vehicle was designed to be rugged. It wasn't the nice flagship with the wonderfully painted panels on the sides, but it was built to be rugged, durable, and tough
Because there was no interstate highway, no pavement between here and the Black Hills.
Right. It was kind of a terrible experience to go ahead and ride 300 miles at the speed of a horse from Wyoming to South Dakota and then back again. And this particular vehicle, apparently, after the gold rush was over and railroads were established, it was retired, but kind of wandered around here around Cheyenne for years afterwards, doing a variety of jobs, sometimes being used as a taxi for VIPs or something like that in town. Well, Cheyenne Frontier Days, one of their first purchases that they actually made was an old stagecoach. And my suspicion is that we've got several stagecoaches that are from that time period. But it's my suspicion this might be the one. Wow. This vehicle was probably the first carriage purchased by Cheyenne Frontier Days during its second Frontier Days, used for stagecoach holdups, because you got to have that with the Wild West show.
And there were a lot of them when the actual stagecoach was in operation.
Right. So
they'd rob them for their poke going up the country and rob them for their gold when they were trying to get back to Cheyenne.
Well, absolutely. So people in Cheyenne, this is something visceral. They knew about it, and so they knew how to react to these things. But of course, yes, it depended on what time of year or what era you're talking about, whether it's being held up by bandits, road agents, or whether it's being attacked by Indians. So it kind of saw a little bit of everything. What we do know about this vehicle, this one particular one that I have, is that it was in use in Cheyenne Frontier Days, especially in the year 1907. And at that point, there's a man by the name of C.B. Irwin, or Charles Burton Irwin, who was one of the founders of Cheyenne Frontier Days and definitely a promoter. He loved to go ahead and produce. He brought Indians down from the Pine Ridge Reservation, so he brought down the Sioux. He also provided many of the cowboys, the rough stock, the horses, the cattle, the steers, would bring them to Cheyenne Frontier Days and give people something to see. And then, of course, he had daughters who were contestants in the relay race, and he was an announcer for the rodeo. So, I mean, he did just about everything. But he also was a man of many talents and was a man of opportunity, got himself in as a railroad agent for the Union Pacific Railroad, and got a way to have stuff that he wanted to ship shipped all over the United States for far cheaper than anybody else. And he decided that since he was involved with Cheyenne Frontier Days already and had all these contacts, he was going to create his own Wild West show. And he called it the the Irwin Brothers Cheyenne Frontier Days Wild West Show. There was a little bit of a problem with him using the name, but he toured with that until 1917.
Wow.
All right. He took this particular stagecoach with him all the way across the United States, even into Canada, to go ahead and have stagecoach holdups. Now, excuse me, after 1917, his son was killed here at Cheyenne Frontier Days, and his son was a wonderful cowboy, but also a trick rider, did fancy horses and everything else, like the Lippensonners. Kind of took the wind out of CB's sails, and he and his brothers broke up the Irwin Brothers Wild West Show. Well, this vehicle was now languishing a little bit, and Cheyenne Frontier Days, as I had mentioned in one of your previous podcasts, decided to start doing more sophisticated parades. In 1925, or probably in 1922, this stagecoach was used. We know it was used in 1911 to have Indians going back and forth and parade for Cheyenne Frontier Days. But by 1922, it was used for a parade by Margaret Boyce, and then in 1925 became part of the original parades that we still enjoy at Cheyenne Frontier Days today, following exactly the same patterns, the pageant of Wyoming transportation.
Yes.
So this stagecoach that traveled 300 miles one way on a trip to South Dakota and back again, maybe several times a week, now had then gone across the nation to become a stagecoach and stagecoach robberies all over the place, now is going on parades and continued to roll in parades for Cheyenne Frontier Days from 1927 without a break until 2010.
Wow.
And so this vehicle, you would be able to put on 1, maybe 4 miles a year or more on this carriage for 120 years.
Wow.
Or so, or about that, so, about to 2010. Well, when this vehicle was finally retired, I had pushed the vehicle. I was here when it was retired, and the wood was so old that it sounded like rolling a bowl of Rice Krispies across the floor because it would pop and snap and crack. They decided it needed to be retired. It's one of the first vehicles that they ever have officially retired from the parades. And so it sits in my museum now, and it's wonderful. It's got all kinds of graffiti all over it. Parts have been replaced. Stuff that's plywood now that was originally other paneled wood. They decided to go cheap. Again, run by volunteers, so they had to do what they had. But you have people that have written their names on the cushions from the 1920s and the 1930s. On one panel, somebody got into the park and carved IWW for the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, right? Yeah. Carved that on one of the side panels. And this vehicle, even though it was retired in 2010, has two other claims to fame. When Wyoming celebrated the United States bicentennial, our presentation, our float that rolled down Pennsylvania past the Capitol building and the White House was that carriage.
Wow.
They decided there was no other vehicle that should do it, so they used that one to parade representing our state at the bicentennial parade in 1976.
Amazing.
And then in 1980, they used it as a parade float in the Cotton Bowl when Wyoming made a chance to go down there.
Wow.
So this vehicle has been a lot of different places, but it's my estimation, and if I might be going wrong with this, but of course, it's our carriage, so I'm very partial to it. I would put it up against any other vehicle as probably the one horse-drawn vehicle with more miles on it than any surviving horse-drawn vehicle on planet Earth.
Right.
And I did some very awful math. My wife, who's a math teacher, disagrees with me completely, but I think that it's put on more than 1 million miles in its lifetime.
Wow.
And that's almost from here to the moon and about halfway back.
Wow. Great story.
It's a great story. It's one of my favorite pieces. It's got so much going for it.
Maybe we can take a look at it later.
I hope so.
Anyway, pattern 1853 Enfield artillery carbine, actually a model of 1858 with some interesting story behind it. So that's it for this episode. I appreciate you watching, and thanks again, Mike, for
Thank you, Evan.
hosting
Glad
us.
to have you here.
If you got any questions for Mike or me, put them in the comments and we'll get back to you eventually. So thanks for watching.